We've already reviewed a number of elements of contract. We have reviewed the element of, let me get my screen color going, offer, and acceptance. Then we skipped to consideration. We just reviewed the issue of contractual capacity, and now we're reviewing the aspect of legality. When I learned contract law way back in 1994 in law school, we learned about the 5 elements of contract: offer, acceptance, consideration, capacity, and legality. There are 2 other ways of actually looking at that, as 4 elements: agreement, consideration, capacity, legality, or 6 elements, like in the current book: offer, acceptance, mutual assent, consideration, capacity, and legality. But all of those structures have consideration and capacity and legality in concert. So we're going to look at legality as our last or second to last element of contract. Legality essentially means the ability to do something or contract in a way that is lawful, because the law will obviously not enforce an unlawful contract. If I take out a contract, commonly called a contract, a murder for hire, to kill a prominent official in New Jersey, and I pay, let's say, the would-be assassin $20,000, if the assassin doesn't come through for me, I can't go to Hunterdon County Courthouse and sue for breach of contract, because that would be silly. The law will not enforce a legal or a contract to do an unlawful thing. And that makes that contract void, representing an effort to create a contract that didn't materialize because there was an aspect that was not satisfied. There are a number of different ways in which a contract can become void or as unlawful, and many of them are self-evident. For instance, in an area where gambling is unlawful, gambling contracts would be void. So if I bet on a New Jersey sports team in New Jersey and that continues to be unlawful, that contract would be void. I could not sue to enforce it in court. Usury is commonly known but not necessarily identified by the word usury. Usury is charging too high an interest rate. So if you had a credit card statement, let's say, and you turned to the back of it and you saw different rate calculations based on the state that you reside, you know that you are butting up against usury statutes. For instance, a particular state might say 40% per annum is simply too high, making contracts that charge that much unlawful. Another state might say 25% per annum is simply too high, making contracts that charge that much unlawful. These can vary from state to state. And then we have blue laws. Again, you were familiar with them, but you didn't necessarily know how to identify them and for what reason. These are prohibitions against contract on Sunday. Most commonly, we see them in the car industry. Dealerships cannot open on Sunday. We also might see them in alcohol as common, that can't sell alcohol on Sunday or before a specific time. But in the county of Bergen, which is up in northern half of New Jersey, and specifically in the area of Paramus, which is home to the Paramus Park Mall, you would know, I think, that the second most popular retail day is Sunday, and that mall is closed in its entirety on Sunday because of the restrictive Paramus blue laws. You cannot contract on Sunday, so you cannot sell hair dryers or jewelry. I'm trying to think of things that are commonly found in a mall. Small appliances and those sorts of things. The Paramus Park Mall is closed. When you contract with a person who is licensed, you have to identify the purpose of the license. Is it to assure competency or simply to raise revenue? When an attorney goes to become a licensed attorney, they go to school, they pass a test, called the bar examination. They also pass an ethics test. They then take an oath. And at the end of all of those things, they pay a fee. And they pay a fee every year. This is what a lawyer does. That license is to assure competency. If you contract with an unlicensed lawyer, that contract is void. In some states, bartenders are required to have a license. In terms of what bartenders have to do, I'm going to change my color here. We'll make the red the bartending color. Do they have to go to school? No. There is no legal requirement to go to school. Do they have to take a test? Show that they know how to mix a margarita? Pour a shot? No. Do they take a test on ethics? No. An oath. I promise to always serve a shot and a quarter. Always to pour cold drinks whenever somebody calls them. No. They don't do any of that. What they do is pay a fee. In this case, that sort of contract is lawful, which means that if you have a contract with an unlicensed bartender and you have 3 drinks and then you find out that the bartender is unlicensed, that contract is still valid. You are still under the obligation to pay for your drinks. So when you're contracting with unlicensed people, it is important to determine whether or not that license is to assure competency, in which case that license, that contract would be void, or if it's simply just to raise revenue, in which case that license would be valid. Other contracts that might be self-evident to you are bribery contracts, contracts to defraud creditors, that is, or to defraud creditors, to hide your money in some respect, contracts to commit a crime, or any crime, or to commit a tort, any tort, are all illegal contracts. Then we get down to unconscionability, which we've seen in a prior time. Unconscionable contracts are contracts that are so oppressive that they grossly favor one side or the other. I'm going to again change my ink color, and we will see that in a particular consumer contract with a business, as an example, the consumer contracted to give the business a total of $50 per month over, let's say, 6 years for the business to extend credit and also to offer for sale a, what was it? Freezer. It was a freezer. Now, when we do this math that is identified at the screen, at the top of the screen, $50 per month for 6 years. We'll do 12 times 6. I have my handy dandy calculator out, which is 72 months times $50, which is $3,600 for a freezer. Now, if you were to tell me, that's an awful expensive freezer, you'd be right. If I were to tell you that the contract that I'm describing is from the late 1970s, you would say, my goodness, that's the Cadillac of freezers. If I were to tell you that the folks who purchased this particular freezer were on public assistance and they lived in assisted housing, you'd say, oh my goodness, how did that happen? This is an unconscionable contract where the business had all of the bargaining power, and that's why the terms were so incredibly one-sided in this instance. Right? Oh, I can highlight there. Not so good on black, though. But the terms were so incredibly one-sided in this particular instance. Contracts in restraint of trade. These are actually pretty common business contracts. We cannot contract to restrain against competition, and these happen both in sales contracts and in employment contracts. So in sales contracts, they might say that you can't compete with the business within a certain number of feet for a certain amount of time. You sell your business, you sell the goodwill along with it. The purchaser would like to purchase the goodwill and therefore doesn't want to open or want you to open another operation that is in a similar sort of industry for that particular length of time, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, the folks that you ultimately agree on. And I'm just changing colors here for a little bit. However, in the employment context, they're a little bit more of concern because we don't want people, while as we restrain competition, we don't want people to be out of a job. So we want to restrain it enough so that there are protections, but not to get somebody out of a job. And so we'll look for reasonable limitations on time, on scope, and on geography. Once had a job teaching test prep, and I was restrained from competing, going into another test prep organization for 1 year after the termination of my employment. Doesn't matter who terminates it, whether you get fired or you quit, within the Philly metro area, teaching test prep. And that was reasonable in all three, because if I waited over 1 year, I would be able to continue to teach test prep in the Philly metro area on the 366th day. So 1 year was not too long to be out of work in that specific area called test prep. So that was the scope. If I were going to go and do tutoring, let's say in math, or tutoring in English, that's not test prep. I could still do that. I could still be a teacher of math or English. I could do test prep in any other subjects that I was not involved with any sorts of tests. So the scope was narrowed enough. And the geography. The Philly metro area was the only way I was constrained. If I decided I wanted to go do test prep, I could do it immediately, not wait out the year if I just went to New York. So, or any other place outside the Philly metro area. So that particular covenant not to compete was reasonable in terms of time, in terms of scope, and in terms of geography. So that was lawful. However, if it was unreasonable on those parameters, if it was 5 years, or restrained me from teaching, or spanned the entire nation, any one of those terms would be enough to make it unreasonable. And if it's unreasonable, it is then unlawful, and an unlawful or illegal contract would be void. So I hope this helped you understand the concepts in this particular chapter. See you in class.